Epilogue. A single horn blast trumpeted across the landscape. From this distance they could spy men rushing to the ramparts, tiny black forms scurrying between machicolations. Built solely for defense, Audiobook was a sprawling fortress that Page had once viewed a scabrous creation, sullying the beauty of the English meadow upon which it was seated. The cavalcade stood well outside of missile range, yet close enough to make out standards. Flying against a vivid red sea, her father's two-headed falcon whipped along the breeze. News would have preceded them by now, but until they faced the men who held the garrison, they could not know how this would go. Page reined in her mount, sidling up to her laird husband, and sat for a moment, simply taking in the sight. The familiar donjon keep, the soaring corner towers, the massive 20-foot-thick walls built with old Roman ingenuity and stone. Audiobook Castle appeared much the same as it had the day she'd left, save for a small footbridge her father must have installed after widening the moat. And yet, despite its nearly impenetrable defenses, those walls had not been able to hold her within. The last time she'd set eyes upon her childhood home, she'd been not more than a lass, and far too willful to remain locked up behind those castle walls, much to her own good fortune. The stars must have been aligned with her that day, for that was how she'd met Ian after sneaking out to take an evening swim. If she but closed her eyes, she could spy him now standing before her as he had that day, the silver at his temples rivaling the glint of the setting sun. "Catching glowworms, perchance?" she'd asked him, because he'd stared a bit too long, mouth agape. She had been captured in her chemise. Wet and looking more like a stray, he'd nevertheless seemed entranced. "Bones of the bloody saints," he'd said. "'Tis no wonder your da lets you about in the middle of the night. He's like to be hoping you'll lose your way in the dark." There was truth to his words, and his barb had wounded her. No one had ever cared where Page went or what she did, until the day she left this place. "Who are you?" she'd demanded hotly, and when Ian did not immediately reply, she'd asked, "Have you no tongue, Scot?" For the space of an instant he'd seemed taken aback by the question, stunned perhaps, and then he'd surprised Page with the rich timbre of his laughter. 12 years had gone by since that day, 12 years of that very same laughter, wherein she'd thought never to return to this place. She cast a glance at her husband, reaching out to beg his hand. "Ready?" he asked, and Page nodded resolutely. All that her father had kept from her as a child was now hers to bestow. Malcolm trotted up beside them, maneuvering his mount next to Page. He peered up at her with a question in his eyes, in much the same manner his father had. "Art certain?" he asked, as though she might change her mind. Quite a lot had happened since the night her father died. Malcolm was stronger now, bolder, filled with the strength of his own convictions and very little fear. That day in the woods, when he took her father's life, all trace of his youth had fled from those stark blue eyes. Pensive and full of purpose, there was little left of the boy in him now. Page's gaze softened at the sight of her eldest child. "I am ready," she assured, and then she proceeded to tug the signet ring off her finger, handing it to her son, her one and only son, since God seemed to have blessed her only with girls. She laid a hand upon her belly, only slightly bumped, and smiled a secret smile. As yet, not even Ian realized, and she hadn't yet told him because she knew he'd never allow her to come. But they could not delay this any longer, lest Audiobook become forfeit to the king. She gave Malcolm the ring that had once belonged to her lord father, offering it up in her palm. It was a small gold signet ring with 2 feathers striking through a fleur-de-lis bearing the motto Altium Citius Fortius, swifter, higher, stronger. That day in the forest, her father's spirit took wing long before Ian arrived, right there whilst she knelt beside him on the forest floor, weeping with her head upon his chest. The fates were cruel, she'd thought, for just when it seemed he had changed his heart and come to embrace her, the gods intervened and took his soul away. She only prayed he was now with her mother, the two of them waiting for her wherever they might be. Malcolm took the ring from her palm, and Paige gave him a warm, reassuring smile. "Put it on your small finger, Malcolm. Remember, what happens from the moment you ride through those gates will determine how they receive you. You are Aldurg's new lord." Still, he seemed to hesitate, and Paige could only guess at his thoughts. He was far more brooding than his father, although some would belie that claim. And, in fact, she recalled a time when they'd hailed him as a murderer and a fiend. Now his son must overcome a similar epithet. "You have the writ from David and my father's ring. That will be enough." The countries were at odds now. Henry of England was dead after eating a number of bad eels, or so they'd said, but there were some who suspected he'd been poisoned. Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, moved at once to seize the throne, and his daughter Matilda now prepared for war. Once Malcolm wrested control of Aldurg, Stephen would no doubt cede to him the baronetcy, if for no other reason to lessen the number of barons prepared to do battle against him. If somehow Matilda managed to take her rightful place, Paige would intervene, petitioning for the baronetcy on her son's behalf. In either case, David would support Malcolm's claim, for Scotia's king meant to strengthen his hold over Northumbria, and Malcolm would provide him another means to do so, whether or not he'd slain its lord. Some also claimed the bastard son. But Paige and Malcolm knew the truth. Her own brother had prepared to kill her, and her father stood ready to protect her. Malcolm accidentally took his life. Up on the ramparts, she could see the watch signaling for the portcullis to be raised. "You are my son," she told Malcolm when he sat unmoving upon his mount. Even as young as he was, she had every faith he was ready to embrace this destiny. God willing, her husband would have many years remaining, and if she bore Ian no more sons, Malcolm would inherit Aldurg along with Craigach Vuor. In the meantime, he was no longer fated to build his legacy in his father's shadow. Paige studied him, seated upon his war-horse, his deep golden hair ruffling in the morning breeze. "Are you ready, Mal?" his father asked. Behind them, an army provided by David of Scotia stood ready to defend his claim. Peering down at the sigil ring, Malcolm slid the golden two-headed falcon upon his finger and gave Paige one final glance. He nodded firmly, spurring his mount forward, once and for all taking the lead, a boy now become a man. Paige and Ian shared a proud glance and then fell into pace behind their son, moving swiftly toward the open gates. Dressed in her father's cloak and wearing his sigil ring, Malcolm Ciaun Raz, hothead as they'd begun to hail him, rode in before them, looking like a king in his own right. He carried with him all the fury of the north. Cantering along behind him, Paige rode through Aldurg's gates, first the anterior, and then through the barbican, across the moat, and into the familiar bailey. "Welcome home, Lady Aldurg!" someone shouted up at her, and then another, "Welcome home!" One after another, her father's kinsmen hailed her as she passed, familiar faces welcoming her home. Paige sat a little straighter in the saddle. No more was she that nameless child for whom nobody had cared. In truth, she didn't need her father's legacy to feel esteemed, and yet, one by one, they gave her obeisance, falling to their knees. Tears swam in her eyes. Welcome home. She heard the last greeting whispered at her ear as the wind blew the curls of her hair. Her father's voice, perhaps but a memory, but she felt him in her heart. Welcome home, he said. Welcome home. Afterword. Dearest reader, throughout the years I've gotten countless emails from readers lamenting the lack of an epilogue in The MacKinnon's Bride. Many reviews shared that sentiment, and I've had a few who gave the book one less star for the lack of one. At the time I wrote The MacKinnon's Bride, it just didn't fit the story, and yet it is the only full-length Highland Brides book that doesn't have one. So why an epilogue now, after all these years? In part, I wrote it for you. In part, I wrote it for me. I really wanted to revisit these characters and see them happy. But if you're following along in the Guardians of Stone series, you know these books are connected and take place there about the same time. The next two Guardians books will leap forward 11 years to 1135, and yes, you guessed it, one of them will be about Malcolm. I won't give away his destiny, but if you think about it really hard, you can pretty much figure out who his soulmate will be in Highland Fury. One thing I will tell you, however, if you follow medieval history, you know that the proverbial brown stuff is about to hit the fan. King Henry of England dies December 1st, 1135, plunging England into civil war. Stephen is crowned on December 22nd, the eve of the winter solstice, and will spend the next 19 years until his death defending his throne against Henry's daughter Matilda. Highland Storm and Highland Fury will both take place during these years of turmoil. Think you have an idea who Malcolm's destiny is? Send me an email and tell me who you think it might be. And be sure to sign up for my mailing list so you don't miss any updates. Much love, Tanya. This is Braden Wright. It's been my great pleasure to narrate Tanya and Crosby's The Highland Brides series and to spend time with you along the way. Have you also listened to Tanya's Guardians of the Stone and The Daughters of Avalon series? All three series are related with shared characters, so we hope you will continue your reading and listening journey in the Highlands with Tanya and Crosby's books. You can find out more about Tanya and Crosby and other authors with Oliver Heber Books by visiting us online at oliver-heberbooks.com. That's oliver-heberbooks.com. Thank you for listening. This has been MacKinnon's Hope, a Highland Christmas Carol, written by Tanya Ann Crosby. Narrated by Braden Wright. Copyright 2015 by Tanya Ann Crosby. Production copyright 2016 by Tanya Ann Crosby.